Thank you very much. Good morning also from my side, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today here at the conference. I hope you can all hear me well, and I'll spend the following 15 to 20 minutes to share the experience that Germany has with its energy transition, with the approach of phasing out at the same time the use of fossil fuels and nuclear and replacing it with renewable energy. I'll now start the screen sharing. I hope this worked successfully. And before going into the strategy that Germany is adopting to secure its future energy supply, I just wanted to share with you the ongoing phase out of nuclear energy in Germany. As many of you will be aware, this is a decision that went hand in hand with the introduction of the renewable energy law around the year 2000. So already then, 2 decades ago, there was a strategic decision to ramp up the availability of renewable energy resources and ramp down the use of nuclear. We are about to conclude this nuclear phase out. We had 3 units that came offline with the shift of the year from 2021 to 2022, and the conclusion is scheduled for the end of 2022. Now, if we look at whether this strategy of ramping up renewable energy was successful, it's fair to say that indeed the effort that pioneering countries, Germany was one of them, but there's many others, that this effort was successful and that renewable energy now is the cheapest way to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity or energy in general for that matter. Also, an additional advantage is that renewable energy can be scaled very quickly owing to its modular nature. And this is in stark contrast with what we see with the existing nuclear projects, in particular in Europe, that have been characterized by quite a bit of high cost and time overruns. Now, if against the background of these cost developments and the availability of scaling up, renewables are a feasible strategy to reach climate neutrality, what does such a strategy look like? And we have published a study in the past year, in 2021, Climate Neutral Germany 2045. And this study looks at 3 steps that we need to take to achieve climate neutrality. Now, shortly after the study came out, just a few days, the German Constitutional Court required the government to tighten the German climate law. And the pathway that is shown in this study is now very closely mirrored in the current German climate protection law. Now, the first step is a reduction until the year 2030. Compared to the year 1990, this reduction must be at least 65% of emissions. And you can see that the most important sector that has to contribute to this reduction is the power sector, with a coal phase out until 2030. Now, some of you might think with the lower availability of gas, how it is possible to still achieve this. Well, you see here in this scenario, we have 70% of renewable electricity. However, the government has, with the new government, raised this target to 80%. And that's one of the elements that allow to maintain the coal phase out and still reach the climate reduction targets. Another point that becomes clear from this graph is that climate neutrality is not just about the power sector, but that we need to reduce the emissions also in transport, in industry, and notably buildings. However, as you'll see later, electricity also is crucial for achieving CO2 reduction in these sectors. Now, this was step number 1. Step number 2 and 3, you can see from this chart that shows the overall reduction of emissions until the target of climate neutrality is achieved. In the middle of the graph, you see the minus 65%, which is this first step that I just showed you. Then there is a second step out to 2045, where we have a certain amount of residual emissions, a 95% reduction. Then the third step, following the second step that we need, is to also take care of these residual emissions. You'll see it on a later graph. These are primarily from agriculture, actually. And for that, we need technologies to actually mobilize negative emissions. Now, this is the broad roadmap, these 3 steps to achieve climate neutrality. What are the strategies to get there? The first one, very clearly, is a massive expansion of renewable energies. And the new traffic light coalition government has set very, very ambitious targets in this respect. We have 80% renewables until 2030, and the government has also published a draft law with the target of a nearly fully renewables power sector by 2035. Now, to achieve this, you see this very ambitious ramp-up pathway of renewable electricity production. And it will be clear that mobilizing not just the renewables, but also the infrastructure and the flexibility are crucial to achieve this objective. Agora is currently working precisely on a study that looks deeper into this question, also highlighting the grid expansion need and flexibility requirements, but also options that we have to achieve this. The second strategy is energy efficiency. The use of fossil fuels is associated with very high losses. If you look at an internal combustion engine car, about 2/3 of the energy are lost as heat, and only 1/3 is turned into useful energy. So as we swap out fossil energy and replace it with electricity, we have a natural efficiency gain. That's one of the reasons why we can halve the primary energy consumption, so cut it in half from compared to 2018 to 2045. Another element, as I'll show in the next step, is the use of electrification, and doing so also in end-use sectors. If we look at the new situation following the invasion of Russia in Ukraine and the war there, associated with these very high fossil fuel energy prices, we see an even stronger role for energy efficiency. And indeed, the German government has just announced yesterday a comprehensive set of measures to boost energy efficiency further as compared to its existing plans. The third strategy is electrification. Electrification is a useful pathway because in the past, we used molecules, energy-rich molecules, to make everything, use them directly, or make electrons. Today, the cheapest source of energy is a green electron, is electricity from wind and solar power. So using that electricity directly makes a lot of sense. We can use it, for example, in order to drive cars with electric mobility, but also to supply space heating via heat pumps, but also industrial process heat, either with heat pumps for temperature levels up to, let's say, 150 degrees centigrade. But if we go higher, 500, for example, there's other options to electrify directly. Against the background of the tight supply situation of gas, also here an accelerated electrification is crucial, especially ramping up heat pumps. The fourth strategic pillar is for those areas that cannot be reached with electricity directly. For example, there are requirements for the chemical industry and the steel industry to use really the molecule, but also there's a need in very high temperature applications. In addition, for those times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine for a longer period, hydrogen is the option as a seasonal storage. This can be hydrogen directly, but it can also be, for example, the use of derivatives such as ammonia. Speeding up hydrogen imports and its derivatives is another consequence of the new situation in 2022. The fifth and last strategy is how to generate negative emissions. You see here, out of the 63 million tons of annual residual emissions in 2045, almost 2/3 come from the agriculture sector. These are methane emissions, in particular from cattle, but also from fertilizers. And offsetting these emissions requires the use of negative emission technologies. I won't go too much into detail here, but happy to take questions on this subject. So this completes the set of the 5 strategies how we can get to climate neutrality. And I'd like to summarize some strategic conclusions. First, with the war on Ukraine and the new geopolitical situation, energy security is moving back to the center of policy attention. However, for Germany, nuclear is not a strategic option, especially due to high costs and lead time issues. And of course, it's also important that a technology has the social license to operate. And there, the German public opinion has been very stable and clear for a long term that that's not the option of choice. If we look at strategic measures for energy security and climate protection, we actually see that they go hand in hand: build out of renewables, higher energy efficiency, electrification of the sectors where we currently use gas. In order to reach this first step towards climate neutrality, the 65% reduction target, we do need massive efforts in all sectors. Renewable energy, RE, needs to be scaled massively, sustainably, and immediately in order to be able to achieve this. But in addition, we can only meet the goals if we also have a paradigm shift in how we decarbonize the other sectors. If we look at the strategic consequences of this new situation in 2022, there's 3 main lessons. First, efficiency is further strengthened because if we reduce energy now, that immediately takes the pressure off of imports, but also helps save emissions. Second, a ramp up of heat pumps is an absolutely strategic priority because it allows displacing the use of gas, in particular in buildings and industry. And third, a faster and scaled import of hydrogen and its derivatives is indispensable, also the local production, in order to substitute gas in those applications where we really need the molecules. So this concludes the points that I wanted to make to set the scene this morning. Thank you very much for the attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Moc krát děkujeme, pane Müllere, za vaši prezentaci. Poprosila bych nyní i naše účastníky, pokud mají jakékoliv dotazy, tak je mohou směřovat skrze Q&A. Já bych měla na vás, pane Müllere, rovnou dotaz. Vlastně tady v Česku také jsou, řekněme, pobídky, aby se investovalo především do tepelných čerpadel, aby se zvyšovala energetická účinnost. Nicméně třeba některé místní firmy narážejí na to, že i vzhledem k narušením těch dodavatelských řetězců už vlastně během pandemie, takže třeba není dostatek materiálů vlastně pro instalaci třeba těchto řešeních, nebo že nám vlastně chybí i personální kapacity. Tak by mě zajímalo, jestli třeba něčemu podobnému čelíte v současné době i v Německu, že třeba vlastně ten zájem lidí o tepelná čerpadla, o to zvyšování té energetické účinnosti, zateplování a tak podobně zkrátka naráží na třeba nedostatek materiálu či lidských kapacit. Zda je to zkrátka problém pro Německo.
Yes, so yes, this is also an issue in Germany. And indeed, whenever you have a very, very rapid increase in the demand for a technology, it's normal to have supply chain bottlenecks. Of course, these are particularly pronounced, particularly increased with first the situation around Corona and now also the war. In addition, installing a heat pump takes slightly different skills compared to installing a gas boiler. So a degree of training or retraining is also required in order to roll out these options. in terms of the supply chain bottlenecks, yes, they are there, but we also shouldn't exaggerate them beyond the point where it is truly a strategic issue. I think one of the main issues is simply a very high demand, long lead times, and the need to ramp up production. And I think here on the European level, we have to tackle this as a strategic issue where also governments, the European Commission, national governments are really required to ensure that the supply chains are robust and established. I mean, we're having a lot of government intervention to get additional supplies of gas into Europe. I think at least the same amount, actually more attention, needs to flow into making available these technologies, ramping up the production capacity. When it comes to the training of staff, there's an issue that the regular training can take quite a long time, and also that the installation of the products that are on the market now is sometimes overly complicated. And the solution that we see there is to have a targeted training, really to look at kind of the bread and butter skills that are needed to install the units. And second, to focus on technology that can be installed more easily and maybe also operated together with the old heating system. And then once the house is renovated, insulated, you only rely on the heat pump.
Děkuji vám moc za reakci na dotaz. Nám se tu objevil mezi tím dotaz od diváků. Renate Brandner se ptá, zda byste se mohl trošku podrobněji nám říct něco o tématu energetické účinnosti a jestli byste se mohl věnovat opatřením, která vlastně přijala teď Německo, protože, jak tady náš divák píše, tak vlastně v Rakousku by si třeba mnoho lidí více přálo novou, lepší legislativu. Tak co vlastně Německo udělalo pro to, aby se ta energetická účinnost více rozvíjela v zemi?
So there's one very important action area, which is the building sector. Germany is in the process of increasing the standards for newly constructed buildings. So there is a primary energy level where you have to stay below, and essentially the regulation is being tightened. It's called efficiency standard KfW 55 that you now have to reach. And also the support programs are being changed that you really have to have a very energy efficient house in order to benefit from government support. Now, something that is also lacking in Germany is a strategy for renovating the worst buildings. There, a minimum energy performance standard, as it is discussed in Europe, still has to be adopted in Germany as well. And we at Agora are working hard also to push ahead that such measures are implemented. But this is something that is also still needed in Germany. There's a second area in terms of industry. Industries have to, or companies have to perform an energy audit to enjoy certain reductions in the energy price. However, they are not obliged to implement the options that are then discovered in these audits. And being more stringent here and requiring the implementation of these measures is one step that is feasible. Another one is to have tax breaks for companies that are doing energy efficiency improvements. Also here we have new legislation in the pipeline. And then of course, when it comes to switching away from fossils to heat pumps, electric boilers, there's a number of measures either via these so-called carbon contracts for difference, which allows to cover the additional cost of the climate-friendly option, or going together with this, a reform of electricity pricing of grid fees so that using electricity when it's available, when renewables are producing a lot, that then it becomes cheap, and that also improves the cost effectiveness of such energy efficient options.
Děkuji vám moc, pane Müllere, za reakci. Já bych jenom ještě ráda vyzvala naše diváky, aby k pokládání dotazů využili tu aplikaci Q&A, kterou najdete na té spodní liště. Objevil se nám tam mezi tím jeden další dotaz, který bych nyní ráda položila. Ten dotaz se týká dovozu vodíku do Německa. Ten dotaz konkrétně zní, jestli se bude jednat pouze o zelený vodík, to znamená ten vodík vyrobený tady z obnovitelné energie, a z jakých konkrétních zemí se zřejmě bude tady do Německa ten vodík dovážet. Prosím, pane Müllere, o reakci.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial question. So if we look at the main options for producing hydrogen, we would have, of course, renewables, so green hydrogen, then gas and CCS, so-called blue hydrogen, and possibly nuclear. If we look at green hydrogen, there's one option to produce it inside of Germany via electrolyzers that run when you have a lot of wind and solar. You saw the graph, the increase of renewables over the coming years in Germany. And so that we can actually make good use of this electricity also in the summer, electrolyzers are a good option. For that, the capital cost has to come down, or the government needs to support it in order to get to the cost reductions. Now, when it comes to imports, we see it as different depending on if it's hydrogen you're importing or a derivative such as ammonia. Hydrogen itself via pipelines, cooperation in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea is crucial to generate the electricity there. Maybe some electrolyzers on the sea, some electrolyzers immediately onshore. Similarly, will take a bit longer on the Iberian Peninsula, production there, and then pipeline import to Germany. So this is clearly green hydrogen. When it comes to imports of from countries further away, ammonia is the route that we see as most promising. We had some high-profile declarations there, for example, from Australia, from Namibia, and I think you will see a lot more activity from the German government looking at countries, for example, in Africa, democracies that allow for the export of hydrogen derivatives. Now, on the blue hydrogen question, well, there were two main arguments for using blue hydrogen in the German debate. One was scalability, that you can do it rapidly, and the second is cost. But in the middle of a fossil fuel crisis, both arguments no longer hold. So we see the position of blue hydrogen actually weakened, and that also goes to some degree for imports. Now, when it comes to nuclear, in terms of the cost for new builds, that's not really a viable option. And in particular, I think also, as we will learn later in the day, there's a really critical situation with the nuclear fleet in France. So there, it's much more a question, can it meet the electricity demand? And it's out of the picture that you would have additional electricity generation that you could use for making hydrogen. So to cut the long story short, we see green hydrogen directly, but in particular, the derivatives such as ammonia as the main route that we will see in the coming years and decades.